Hello again. In this lecture, I want to describe and explain different divisions that the EU referendum campaign has opened up amongst the electorate. The first thing to note on this point is the fact that public opinion appears rather evenly divided on the question of whether the UK should remain a member of the European Union. There's been a lot of media coverage of how close the vote might be, closer in fact than the 60-40% split in favour of staying in that David Cameron originally hoped for. So let's examine the latest polling figures. Here's a chart from the website whatukThinks.org. It's a site run by Professor John Curtice of Strathclyde University. If you watch election night coverage on the BBC, then you'll be familiar with him. He's Britain's foremost expert on election polling. This figure is called a poll of polls because it averages out the results from the many different organisations that survey public opinion on the forthcoming referendum. What is displayed is the trend in voting intentions from the 1st of October 2015 on the left to the end of May 2016 on the right. The blue line shows the percentage favouring Remain, while the red line shows the Leave camp's level of support. There have been gaps at times with clear leads for Remain, but the pattern over time is that declared voting intentions, so this figure leaves out the don't knows and thus the totals always come to 100%, declared voting intentions are converging on 50% for each camp pretty much. Another thing to note about this tracking of the polls is that the big fanfare surrounding David Cameron's renegotiation does not seem to have had any real effect on voters. A gap opened up in February in favour of Remain, but that quickly disappeared. So there's still everything to play for in the final weeks, as I'm no doubt you are already aware. What is perhaps less obvious is that the headline 50-50 split masks numerous differences between distinct groups within the British electorate. One of the most striking is the regional variation in public opinion across the constituent parts of the United Kingdom. This is something we can see in the following table. This table presents the variation in how people intend to vote across England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. You'll notice that there is data not just from today, but also from 1975. That's because in 1975, the UK held its first ever nationwide referendum on whether to stay in what was then called the European Economic Community, or EEC, which was a precursor to the European Union. Incidentally, although the EEC had fewer competencies, many of the debates 40 years ago centred on similar issues as now, sovereignty and democracy namely. I'm going to return to the 1975 comparison later when we discuss immigration in the context of voting intentions. What's rather intriguing about this data is that it shows how opinion towards Europe has changed since 1975 across these four constituent parts of the United Kingdom. England, where the vast majority of UK citizens live, has become noticeably more Eurosceptic. The difference between the percentage of English voters who chose to stay in the EEC compared with how they would decide now is minus 18.6%. There's also been a big fall in support, nearly 15%, in Wales. However, in Scotland, the figure for those supporting staying in the EU is nearly 7% higher than the number of Scots in favour of the EEC back in 1975. Most remarkably, pro-EU support in Northern Ireland has skyrocketed, up by more than 20%. So let's examine some of these trends in more detail, starting with the situation in Scotland. A big part of the explanation for the rise in pro-EU opinion there is the policy reversal of the Scottish National Party, or SNP, towards European integration. In 1975, The SNP associated the EEC with big business interests, which as a socialist party they opposed alongside staying in the British Union. Nowadays, the SNP, which is by far the largest political party in Scotland, favours Scottish independence within the EU. That's because the single market is considered to offer economic benefits that would offset any uncertainty caused by leaving the UK. In this referendum, the SNP is campaigning for the UK to stay in the EU, although it is doing so separately from the British government, as it does not want to share a platform with Conservative politicians. In Northern Ireland, the explanation is rather different. In this part of the UK, the political situation has evolved remarkably since 1975. Where once there was a heavy British army presence because of the Troubles, today the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland is open. Gone are the road closures, army observation posts, and border checkpoints of the 1970s. The Northern Irish peace process has thus created a stable arrangement in which people are free to come and go across the border as they please. This is a freedom cherished by citizens of both countries, as it makes life much more convenient. Hence, residents in Northern Ireland who travel regularly to the Republic of Ireland are fearful about the possible need to reintroduce border controls in the event of the UK leaving the EU. The symbolism of recreating such a division is also a concern. This helps explain the preference for the status quo in this part of the country. However, the message here is rather confusing because the Northern Ireland Secretary herself, Theresa Villiers, advocates Brexit and argues this would not lead to the reintroduction of checkpoints at the border. Irish government officials disagree with this interpretation, while the Northern Ireland Committee of the British House of Commons says changes in UK-Ireland border arrangements is inevitable in the event of Britain leaving the EU. Now, this clash of perspectives illustrates once again how much this referendum revolves around the question of whom voters trust when thinking about the risks of leaving the EU. Another element explaining regional viewpoints on EU membership is the level of funding received from the EU, and that's what's captured in this image. What it shows is that England, which contains the richest parts of the United Kingdom, benefits less from EU money that is spent on employment. That's the ESF, the European Social Fund, and also money spent on the rural economy. That's the EAFRD, and on top of that, there's also figure for regional funding, the ERDF. So taken together, we see that England benefits much less from all those funds than other regions in the United Kingdom. And Northern Ireland has also benefited greatly from monies earmarked for peace building. Thus, EU spending is much higher in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, meaning residents in these parts have more to lose from rejecting the status quo. This kind of data reveals how political preferences can be shaped by how directly affected people feel about a particular issue. You might want to reflect in your private journal now on how directly affected you feel about the outcome of this referendum.